All right, everybody. Thanks for being here. Welcome to the January of 2022 Sustainability Series. This month, we're happy to host, I'm excited to host Jamie Stolpestad, partner of YardHomes, to give a little bit of overview of the adoption and use of accessory dwelling units across Minnesota, their relevance to Rochester, and their sustainability characteristics too. Just a few kind of just logistical items. We do ask that folks, as they have questions, just type them in the chat during kind of the formal presentation. And then we also have some time towards the end, just kind of an open forum conversation with Jamie too. So we're planning about 40 minutes presentation, 20 minutes questions afterwards. And like I said, questions during the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat and I'll be sure to bring them up with Jamie. I will also be sure to share the slides and the recording of this afterwards to the listserv. If there are others you'd like to forward them to, feel free. And if there are others you'd like to invite to this series in the future, also feel free. This is something we do on a monthly basis, the third Wednesday each month from 12 to 1. So tell all your friends, they're all welcome. We love a big crowd. But with that, I'll get out of the way and hand it over to Jamie. And thanks again, Jamie, for being here. Excited for the presentation today.
Thank you, Kevin. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Happy cold January day. I'm Jamie Stolpestad. I'm a partner in a company called YardHomes. I just will give you a very, very brief overview of what YardHomes is, and therefore sort of the context of my comments for the discussion today. So we provide compact dwellings. Most of the time, these compact dwellings are used as accessory dwelling units. Sometimes those are known as granny flats, backyard cottages, a whole host of other names. And we think that there are a lot of sustainability benefits of those. I'll share a little bit of context of where you can do them and how you can do them and so forth coming up. And maybe by way of a little bit of further background, I've been interested in sustainability topics for quite some time. In a much earlier life, I was the sustainability leader for GE Real Estate's U.S. asset management portfolio. I've had an opportunity to teach some of the sustainability topics for my finance class at NYU Stern Business School, and sort of a lifelong student of some of these topics. So I'll share some perspective. I'm not the end-all be-all expert, and I hope I learned something from all of you too. So see if I can. So I'm intending to cover a few topics here. I'll try to keep it to under 40 minutes, and thanks for questions as we go via chat, and then we can open it up at the end. Let me start with kind of the problem, and then some of the solutions, what, how, so forth. I think ADUs are a key answer to some of these problems, and we'll talk about those, how they've sort of expanded in popularity across Minnesota. They're allowed in more places in Minnesota. Talk about some of the use cases. I'm only going to touch very briefly on kind of the Rochester situation, but I think it's useful for you at least to have some perspective, at least from what I'm hearing, and then we can open it up. So to set the stage, we're in a housing crisis, and there are different dimensions of that crisis. We don't have enough homes, period, and we don't have the right kind of homes. And this nuance about the right kind of homes is something which let me spend a couple of seconds on. So way back when we built most of the homes in most of the communities across Minnesota, we were building them for a nuclear family. Your 3.2 or 4-person household, husband and wife, married couple, 2 kids and a dog. Well, that's not really the reality of most of the communities in Minnesota these days. We have a very significant portion of single-person households. In the metro area, that's roughly 40% of all the households. I don't have the specific figure for Rochester, but I'm guessing it's a bit lower. I'll bet it's 35-ish. And the fastest growing segment are seniors. And that's the case pretty much everywhere, locally, regionally, nationally. If you chat with folks who are seniors, many of them will tell you that their house is too big and it's too burdensome. And if you talk to a lot of folks, they're saying that they're paying too much money for their housing. And then, of course, we've got a significant homeless problem. So many people don't have a home. And then in addition, we've got a climate crisis. And our building stock is a significant contributor to global emissions. This is some statistics from Architecture 2030. This is an advocacy group promoting sort of better operations of our built environment, but roughly 28% of the global CO2 emissions are from the way we operate the building, and about 12% are from the building materials and construction. And this will vary depending upon the stage a particular community is in. If they're in a significant building, they're going to have a lot more emissions from concrete, from steel production, and so forth. If it's a more mature community where there's not as much new construction, then a bigger share is from the operations. So if that's one of the problems, a way to address that in terms of the climate focus, the sustainability focus, is we really need to change what we build, how we build it, and then how we operate our building stock. So that's where I want to focus. So what we build, it's fairly intuitive, but we really need to be mindful of building things that are smaller. And I'm speaking mostly about our housing here. We need to be focused on the building materials and select better materials. And then very significantly, we need to select better building systems. This relates to how we're heating our homes, how we're cooling our homes, how we're ventilating our homes, how we're ensuring good indoor air quality. And then what we build has a little bit to do with where we build. If we build on the furthest extremes of our existing communities, then we have to build more roads. We have to build more sewer systems, and we have to do all sorts of other things. So generally, we want to build in places that already have this important infrastructure. So we want to avoid sprawl. How we build. So significantly, we have to figure out ways to build more efficiently. We really do need to learn how to build more quickly. This is especially a case in a cold weather climate like Minnesota, where we have a relatively short building season. If we were in the Carolinas or Texas or what have you, some people wouldn't emphasize the build quickly as much, but we have a relatively short building season, and we do have these urgencies. And the key issue is we need to enhance the productivity of how we build things. Unfortunately, the building community, the construction trades have been the laggards in productivity enhancements. Just think about the technology in your automobile. Maybe some of you drive electric vehicles, the transformation that's occurred over the past 50 years, 100 years. Think about your cell phone, think about your computers that we're all watching today. The productivity enhancements have been just tremendous. But if you think about the way we build homes, gosh, it's an awful lot like our parents or grandparents or grandparents built homes. So we have to really identify ways to increase productivity. And I think most people think that really drives us to what's called off-site construction techniques. Some people used the term modular, and then there's kind of a span of how we build things differently. So in Sweden, where there's a little company called IKEA, 85% of the homes that people live in are built in a factory. And in the US, that figure is sort of 3 to 5%, depending upon the location. In the Midwest, it's less than 3%. On the East Coast and the West Coast, it's rising. And in Europe, in Asia, it's probably 18 to 22%. So in many other places, we're using the same kind of technological approaches to building homes that we do for automobiles, for cell phones, for all these other products that are ubiquitous in our lives. And the benefit of offsite construction techniques, especially in a cold climate like Minnesota, is that we can build things in a controlled environment. if you've ever gone to one of these plants, you'll notice that all the workers are in short sleeves. They're enjoying a very comfortable working environment. They're not outside wondering if it's going to start raining or snowing or what have you. And if you're building out of wood, all the wood has been sitting inside for some period of time. It's not getting wet. It's not growing mold. And so you're able to build to much higher, tighter tolerances. You're building a much tighter building envelope. And then there's a lot less waste. You'll see that many of the component parts are off in one corner, and they're cut to a very precise tolerance, and they don't have much waste. So it's a much more efficient way of constructing things. So I think that's kind of a key thing. I'm going to do a little bit of a call out here. I put in www.constructionrevolution.io. This is a civic group that was organized by the former Housing Commissioner of Minnesota and funded in part by the McKnight Foundation. And that really tried to address some of the challenges of the housing ecosystem. But I think many of the challenges and then the solutions are significantly applicable to folks thinking about sustainability and climate change.
Jamie, we did get one question in the chat. You may get to this later, but can your design units to the top an existing garage, assuming the garage is newer and engineered? That seems to be a lot of the opportunity in Winona.
Yes. So that's a good question. The specifics of how one designs and meets the various codes is a little bit of a complicated situation. So I might, let's pause on that. I think I'm going to address most of the answer to that question, and then I'll come back and try to be more fulsome. So how we build and then how we operate. There's really a push globally and many parts of the US to focus on all electric buildings. Some people have, they're burning natural gas, or they have propane or what have you. There's various ways in which we're heating our homes. But over time, we really need to be eliminating fossil fuel, and we need to be moving to an electric-based home. This is very possible even in a cold place like Minnesota. Heat pump technology has improved to the point where we can have very low temp systems that do a fine job. Sometimes people feel comfortable, or local codes kind of push us to have some sort of backup redundancy, electric resistance, or perhaps, a fireplace or what have you. But we really need to be operating our homes through electric, and in Minnesota especially, we have a much cleaner electric grid than many other places. So the more we can shift to that clean grid, and the more that grid can be shifted in its power source to renewables, the better off we all are. Somewhat related to that, it's important that we focus on renewable energy systems. These can either be so-called distributed systems at your house, on your roof, in the backyard, what have you, or industrial scale renewable energy systems, which are really what folks like Excel are doing. They're putting massive wind farms and solar farms somewhere in their grid, and they're using that as the basis for energy production. And then I'll somewhat reiterate the comment. We really need to be mindful of how we operate our building stock in ways that leverage existing systems and investments. This is somewhat redundant comment about let's figure out how to do things on an infill basis as opposed to going further and further out and having to rebuild and extend things. So we've got the problem, we've got some of our solutions. So what is an answer? Well, we think that ADUs are an important answer. So ADU is a funny term. It means accessory dwelling unit. That's a term that comes out of our zoning vocabulary. Many folks live in an environment where there's a principal dwelling or primary structure on the lot. For many folks, that's a single family home. Some folks, that's a duplex. And so if you have a zoning construct and a land use construct where that's most of the housing, and you put something else on the same lot, the zoning gurus call that an accessory dwelling. In Minnesota, you have to have a specific ADU ordinance, so you can do that. If your city or county does not have an ADU ordinance, then it's deemed not permitted. Rochester currently has some areas where you can add an ADU, and talking about other areas that it wants to add. The other thing is this notion of a dwelling. I put that in capitals because that's a very particular term under the Minnesota Residential Building Code. So in Minnesota, when we're talking about a dwelling, that's a structure that has a bathroom, a place to prepare food, and a place to sleep. So that sounds like an awful lot like a home. And it must be on a permanent frost-protected foundation. So people who are interested in tiny homes on wheels are going to be a bit disappointed. We don't really allow tiny homes on wheels to be permanent dwellings. There are some tiny homes on wheels in different places, but most of what folks live in are on permanent foundations. They're hooked up to water and sewer, whether that's municipal water and sewer or a well and a septic system. Minnesota has, over the past decade, increased the number of cities and counties where ADUs are allowed. We're at about 30 jurisdictions right now. And our YardHomes research suggests that there's roughly 300,000 eligible parcels to add an ADU. And then another way you can use these sort of compact structures is to put a cluster of these dwellings together on a vacant lot. Some people call that a cottage home park. Some people call that a cluster development. Some people call that a small village. Senior cottage village has all sorts of names, but when we think about smaller dwellings, we can put them individually in a backyard, or we can put them collectively to make up essentially a multifamily horizontal development. Here's a list of what we believe to be the current sort of market. There's a couple little caveats to these, and a couple areas where there's a single asterisk next to the city name. Not the entire city, but portions of the city are in zones where there's ADUs that are allowed, and that includes Rochester. The double asterisk is getting into sort of the nuance of types of ADUs. There are attached ADUs. These are within the existing structure, kind of like a duplex. And then there's detached ADUs where it's a separate structure, typically in the backyard. So some of these jurisdictions allow one type of ADU and not the other type of ADU. And there's quite a number of folks, different communities that are studying ADUs that don't currently have them. It seems as though there's 1 to 4 new communities added every year in Minnesota. So this will give you a sense. So for those of you who live in Rochester, you're potentially in luck. And this is kind of a big market. So why would one want to have an ADU ordinance and consider an ADU? Well, I think there's sort of 3 rationales. The first is sort of the locational benefits. We're putting new homes in places that utilize our existing infrastructure. And it's a fairly so-called gentle way to add density. You're not tearing down homes and building giant apartments. You're just sort of softly adding something else where there's been some existing land. The size benefits are significant. These are less resource intensive because of their size. They actually fit a number of people's needs, especially single person households. And then for this audience, especially the energy efficiency and performance benefits are significant. It's fairly easy to create an all electric ADU. They're pretty compact. If you're doing a detached ADU, this will typically be a new structure, so you can take advantage of all sorts of new materials and a new focus on how to do insulation and air sealing and so forth. We focus on projects that use structurally insulated panels. This is a wall system where the interior and exterior are a OSB oriented strand board, essentially a particle type panel, and then they're smushed together with a foam core, and under pressure and with glue and so forth, that creates a very stable and strong wall system. And it prevents so-called thermal bridging. If you build a traditional wall and you have pieces of wood every 16 inches or 24 inches, what have you, the energy can travel through the wood more quickly than it can through insulation. So a traditional wall has an inherent challenge of lots of thermal bridging, whereas a SIP wall does not. And then we also use full volumetric modular. This is where the entirety of the unit is built in a factory. In most cases, that is using a traditional stud frame wall structure. So it does have the inherent challenge of thermal bridging. But these are just two examples of how using ADUs in a compact home setting can drive some good sustainability benefits. Because of the energy efficiency, the tight building envelope, and then usually a somewhat modest range of things inside, it's not terribly difficult to achieve net zero energy performance when you add a fairly modest sized rooftop solar array. So we're looking at fairly compact units, maybe 400 square feet or just below, where 4 modern solar panels are sufficient to drive to a net zero. Many people's homes, if you've considered putting solar panels on the roof, the home itself is not terribly efficient. You have a lot of energy consuming items in the house, so it's pretty difficult to get to net zero. We're even looking at some situations where the size of the roof of an ADU is sufficient to have an even larger rooftop solar system that would offset the energy consumption in the home. So rather than put things on an old roof, put some panels on a new roof and then get the benefits of renewable energy across your lot. In terms of the uses for ADUs, and I'm speaking a little bit more now to the policymakers that might be on this call. It's useful to think about who you're trying to benefit when you're considering an ADU ordinance. And you might remember that table where I showed you that some places allow attached ADUs, but not detached ADUs. We're a big fan of the detached ADU because it tends to be more suited to seniors. So seniors tend to want a single level living environment. They're sensitive about accessibility, and oftentimes they're living alone. So a detached ADU in a backyard can much more easily be set up to be very, very accessible. You can have a very modest ramp from grade up to the living floor level, have a low threshold or no threshold entrance step, and that would be quite suitable for somebody in using a walker and a wheelchair, and then all of the space inside is on the same level. So for those policymakers that are considering this, I'd be a big fan of the detached. Now, there are sometimes situations where somebody wants to carve out an additional unit within their existing home. So having an attached ADU option, it makes sense. That's going to run into some challenges because you need, under Minnesota building code, and especially the fire code, to create a distinct fire separated unit. People sometimes think, oh, I'm just going to take the basement, or I'm going to take the attic and I'm going to make that into a cute ADU. Well, it's easier said than done to make sure that's a distinct unit for your HVAC system, for fire separation. And then a lot of cases, this is not really where an aging parent wants to go. There are a lot of steps to get to the basement or up to the attic, and it's very challenging to create an accessible unit. Again, further to the policymakers in the call, as you consider ADU ordinances, we think it's really important to kind of think holistically. Zoning codes have an awful lot of tests and such, lot coverages and minimum building widths and various other things about who can have certain benefits. So if you're going to consider adding the option for your residents to be able to add an ADU, you oftentimes have to kind of look more broadly at your whole zoning ordinance and make sure that you're getting rid of other barriers.
Jamie, we had a comment in the chat too, just around how easy it is for folks to move with walkers or wheelchairs, especially inside bathrooms and ADUs.
Sure. So it really depends on the design. It's a good question. The ADUs that we offer range from so-called tiny homes, which is under Minnesota parlance, 400 square feet and below. It is possible to create an ADA accessible restroom in that small of a footprint, but it's a little tough. You're going to have a lot more flexibility if you're anywhere between, say, 500 square feet and 800 square feet to carve out a restroom that would be accessible restroom. And it's really about the entrance, the turning radiuses, and sort of how you position various, things, toilets and sinks and so forth. But yeah, you can achieve an ADA accessible space in a small dwelling.
Then there's one other question on that same thread, Jamie, around clarification between ADA and universal design. Are they?
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, some good questions. Thank you. The ADA is the Americans with Disability Act. It's a specific legislative regulatory construct to provide more accessibility to primarily folks with disabilities. And that is enforced across a wide range of building types. So especially public buildings, city halls, libraries, et cetera. You'll have folks who are very mindful of, do they satisfy ADA requirements, which were highly technical requirements to ensure that somebody in a wheelchair can get in and out and use the space. Universal design is a term that's a little looser, and it reflects a movement within primarily the architectural community to consider various aspects of the space when you're designing it. A number of years ago, people might use the term age-friendly design or ageless design, and it sort of evolved to be coined as universal design. So universal design principles are really more principles than highly specific technical rules to try to drive greater accessibility for a wide range of folks across a wide range of age and abilities. An example, very practical, is that universal design would encourage not putting the microwave over the range because it's very difficult to access. They would say, well, let's put the microwave next to the range or on a counter, under a counter. It's a lot easier to get to. Whereas the ADA rule will say we need an opening to the restroom of 36 inches and a circle of maneuverability of 5 feet. I think the general point I wanted to convey in this slide was just to think about who you're trying to serve when you're considering, what sort of a ADU ordinance to craft. And then secondly, on this whole topic of ADUs in use, this is especially interesting to folks in smaller communities across greater Minnesota. These are clusters of small dwellings. Many communities have these, from many years ago. They're a cluster of small dwellings. Sometimes they're organized around a garden. They're of modest density. Sometimes they're called pocket neighborhoods, cottage home parks, and so forth. These are just two illustrations. The one in the middle, the bottom, is an illustration of a kind of more of a garden court with small dwellings organized around pathways and trees and so forth. And then the kind of diagram on the right side is of a double lot in an urban setting where there are 5 dwellings, D1 through D5, organized around a courtyard and with surface parking on an alley. So that's an urban interpretation of a garden court. And we think that many communities, smaller communities in and around greater Minnesota, would find these quite attractive.
You help folks understand the lot sizes that were on those?
Sure. So the image on the upper, on the right side, I believe that's an 85 by 165 foot lot. We purchased a lot in Minneapolis that was a 10,000 square foot lot, and we have a plan to put 6 units of different scales on that. We're working on a lot in St. Paul that's just under 10,000 square feet, and we can achieve 4 units plus a fair amount of space for parking or workshop or what have you. And different cities have different, thresholds and different aspirations, but the key thing is, instead of kind of having this mindset that there's one parcel and there's one primary structure, you kind of shift your mindset and say there's a parcel and you can put multiple structures on it. And so it's kind of like thinking about a horizontally organized apartment complex as opposed to, all the apartments in one building.
It says it's gotten some questions going in the chat, Jamie. So I guess the first one's like understanding the difference between what you're showing in like a planned unit development and is the exclusion of a planned unit development. Would that not allow something like this to be developed on a site? And
so
then
we get some planners in this discussion. So to address that, so these are fairly technical questions from a zoning perspective. So many communities, have different land use designation. So residential designation would presume a certain composition of a principal dwelling, maybe and an ADU in back. And then they might say, oh, but you can do a planned unit development, which is essentially a site-specific sort of negotiated arrangement of zoning. And that, could allow for this type of thing. In some communities, they have what's called an overlay to a residential zone. So in St. Paul, Minneapolis, Duluth, and I'm sure there are other places, but those where I'm most familiar, as long as your lot size is X square feet or Y feet of frontage or larger, you can then have an overlay of a cluster development. And how communities interpret and set rules, it's all over the board. My personal, pitch would be try not to make things overly complicated. If you want a variety of housing outcomes, you've got to make your zoning flexible, and you've got to figure out, well, how many hurdles do you want people to jump through to get to these different, more creative outcomes?
Then one other follow-up to Jamie on this is like, typically are the lots vacant for something like this, or do you need to demolish a dwelling? Or
well, it's certainly easier. Yeah, it's certainly easier to start with a vacant area. And the one I mentioned in Minneapolis, the 10,000 square foot lot, we purchased that vacant. The neat thing that I tell cities is look at the most odd, difficult, challenging sites that you own, your HRA owns, that might be owned by the highway, department, right of way, things that just haven't really lent themselves to a conventional rectangular single family lot development, and give us a shot to just, think differently. If we're using smaller dwellings and we are organizing them around the topography of the land or the existing tree lines or what have you, you can come up with a lot of really creative, unique housing developments. And it opens up just a lot of opportunity. So cities that we talk to and others, this is sort of a aha moment. You show some of these images and they say, it doesn't all have to be 40-foot lots. It doesn't have to be 60-foot lots. It doesn't have to be sort of this conventional typography. We can achieve increases in housing in nooks and crannies in clever ways that we hadn't thought about before. So I'm gonna try to wrap up here a little bit. So so here's some local issues. So there are probably folks on the call who can correct me, but I believe that ADUs are allowed in the R2X zones in Rochester. These are kind of infill, more urban areas that have been guided for more intense infill development. This is a fairly small portion of the city of Rochester today. There are efforts underway to create a so-called unified development code. This is essentially a modernized zoning ordinance. And under the current drafts, they would allow ADUs across the entire city of Rochester. There's a lot of details that are being discussed and worked out. You know, where in a lot can you put one? What are the sizes and dimensions and styles and so forth? So if these are topics that you're interested in, I'd encourage you to engage. The city of Rochester is doing a very good job of communicating through various websites and listening sessions and all kinds of other outreach efforts to make sure people are aware of what's going on and to have a voice. And then just, you know, from the broader Minnesota perspective, when cities create a zoning ordinance with an ADU provision, they don't oftentimes get it right. And by right, I mean they don't achieve something that's terribly practical for people who want an ADU. So I think it's useful for those who care about this to engage now as some of these parameters are being considered. And I'd encourage you to really think about the practical. Hey, if I'm trying to create an ADU for my aging mother in the backyard, well, what does she need? What does she want? What do I need? What do I want? And is this ordinance going to be practical? What oftentimes happens is a so-called political compromise, where there's a group of folks who want more density, there's a group of people who don't want density or change, and then they kind of create some rules that they can all sort of agree with, but it doesn't actually do any good. It doesn't lead to any sort of practical pathway. And then my last bullet there is sort of education, technical assistance. Zoning is a really, really complicated topic. Your average resident has no clue how this works. But if you're going to create an ADU ordinance, you're opening up an opportunity for your average resident to start becoming a housing developer for their mother, their father, their cousin, their aunt, you know, what have you. And so we're enabling some pretty significant, and I would argue positive change, but we're also introducing a set of activities to the general public that are not their expertise. So I would argue for many of you folks on the call, are there ways that you can help create education programs, awareness? Can you create technical assistant bodies? Maybe they are focused on senior centers throughout the community. Maybe they're additional resources from the city hall and planning to just help people through this process. In many parts of the country, companies like YardHomes have emerged. And this is especially the case in California on the West Coast, where there are many companies that are sort of like going to the car dealer. You can go to the GM car dealers, you can go to Toyota, you can go to what have you, and each have a little different model. They have a little different style, but they offer the whole thing. They give you the car, they'll service the car. And we just haven't gotten to that stage yet in Minnesota. I think we will. And just that whole process is something I encourage people to think about. So that's where things stand. And then I think we're pretty much ready to open it up. So here's some information on us. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to share. I think I hit 40 minutes, Kevin. How am I doing?
On the dot. Right. If only all our speakers would accommodate kind of these time requests as well. So yeah, this is now meant to kind of be more of an open forum for questions. I see some folks are still using the chat, but maybe if folks want to make this more a little bit conversational, we can take down the slides, Jamie, and start to see people's faces if that's cool. One kind of immediate question that came up in the chat here is, might any city require a separate water and sewer line from the street to the ADU? And coupled with this, what might be the cost for development up to placing the ADU on a lot?
Yeah, so under Minnesota law, a dwelling has to be on a permanent foundation. And then in most urban environments, the way in which you provide water and sewer is connecting to the municipal water and sewer service. Some cities allow you to extend the water and sewer that already goes to a principal dwelling to the backyard and make that available to the ADU. That tends to be the most practical and least costly approach. The water and sewer service to the principal dwelling was set up years ago to meet the needs of a 4 to 8 person household. The households are much smaller these days, so adding a little bit of extra demand in the backyard doesn't really have a negative impact in most communities in terms of the actual water and sewer discharge. However, some communities insist that the water and sewer come directly from the street, so there'd be a new tap. That's inherently more complicated and more expensive. So we find this to be a very challenging explanation to customers, because in the city of Minneapolis, you can attach the water and sewer to the main house, whereas across the river in St. Paul, you can't. You have to go to the city. So it's a very useful, practical issue. I would encourage people not to think about this as a barrier to creating an ADU ordinance. It's a practical consideration for how one implements the construction of ADUs. And to the extent that there's communication between the planning department of Rochester and the utility providers, that's helpful. Maybe some of the technical assistants can address these issues, but every city in America has had the same issues. How do you cost effectively provide utilities to a new home?
Great, thank you, Jamie. There's one other note in the chat from Helen, and that the City for Good has hosted Jamie to learn more about ADUs, and they're continuing on in 2022 for some more ADU education. So if you'd like to be added to their distribution, please feel free to reach out to in the City for Good, and the emails there too. Also good. I'll go for it, Jamie.
I was going to ask a question back to the audience. Does anybody on the call have any sort of family member living in an ADU anywhere in America? No, my goodness. So so this is one of our challenges. So many of the times when I ask that question, somebody answers yes. And it's usually a relative that lives somewhere on the West Coast. Sometimes it's a relative or extended family member that lives in Europe. And then there's an interesting dialogue about, oh, mom or dad reached to a point and we had to consider this or that. And so for many folks in Minnesota, we don't really think of an ADU as a housing option. We think about assisted living, apartments, one other family member, to help with an aging family member. And I just hope that we start thinking about ADUs as an option. It's not a new thing. It's a little bit new here, but it's really not a new thing if you think about kind of the national landscape. AARP is one of the biggest advocates of ADUs. They create these wonderful design competitions all over the country. And there's some really delightful, charming, cute, very functional spaces that people live in that are just small and they're in the backyard. So anybody want to do an ADU in a way that really, really promotes the highest aspirations of sustainability? Kevin might.
I was going to say my mother-in-law keeps sending me examples of ADUs to move into our backyard. So we'll see if that becomes a reality. But yeah, the sustainability aspect would definitely be a component of it if that's something we end up moving forward with.
So a lot of people don't like to pay electric bills. And so the first thing I would encourage you to do is focus on the benefits of starting fresh and starting new. You can use alternative framing techniques if you want to do a site-built project. So instead of 16-inch on center, 2x6s and putting fiberglass bat insulation in between, there's much more efficient ways to build a wall. You may not find every contractor in town comfortable with that, but I encourage you to look for the ones who are doing unique things that are just more energy efficient. And then, have a real conversation with your insulation contractor. People kind of default to, oh, let's do what we can get at Home Depot. Well, there's a ton of different choices, and you can have an incredibly different building performance if you just select a better insulating product. And then I would consider things like solar as, let's make sure everything's ready for that. Now, you may not want to put the investment in, but put the conduit between your electric panel and the roof, so you don't have to drill a hole in the future. It's super, super easy to put the conduit and you put a little cap on the roof. So if you ever add solar panels in the future, you just run the wire down there. And then there's a lot of really, really wonderful products and pieces of equipment. Ductless mini splits, super quiet, super responsive. That's a great way to heat and cool. The efficiencies of those units are just off the charts. Think about induction ranges. Don't necessarily default, oh, I need gas. If you talk to some cooks, they'll say, oh, my induction cooktop is great. I can boil water faster than gas. I don't have a bunch of fumes in my house. Because if you build a tight building envelope and then you burn natural gas inside, you're going to contribute to bad indoor air quality. You don't want to do that. Sorry, I'm just getting on my soapbox a little bit.
No worries, Jamie. One other question did come in here. It's in your experience, any issues with water management when adding more hard surface to a lot?
Fair question. It's a sensitivity that ought to be considered across, an entire community. Many communities are set up on the presumption that there's a 2-car garage plus some sort of basketball hoop or something in the back, and so all of the stormwater calcs are set from that. And we do have some pretty unusual weather patterns now, so we're probably getting more extreme weather events than we ever designed to. So we should think about this, but there are other ways to sort of mitigate that. Green roofs, cisterns, creating just ways to slow down the flow of water within the backyard between landscape elements and so forth. And this is a balancing act. People say, well, gosh, we don't want any more impervious cover in our community. And I would say, well, we do have to balance the need for housing versus the desire for open space. And each community will come out with a different kind of sense of balance there. My bias is we need more housing. I'd rather have people live in a home than in a tent in a park. All right, I'm going to ask a zinger, a really good zinger here.
Any other final questions for Jamie?
Well, you've got my information. If anybody has any questions or interests, please reach out. Email's good. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Kevin. Appreciate this, and hope to be visiting with more of these folks over time. Good luck getting your ordinance passed.
Thank you, Jamie, for your time and thoughtfulness. We really appreciate it.